Now, obviously, the person I was referring to earlier when I called him one of the biggest stars of all time was Antonio Inoki, who was also the founding father of New Japan Pro Wrestling. He died on Friday at the age of 79, or I guess it would have been Saturday already in Japan by that point. Inoki was in poor health for some time. If you remember when they got him on camera to do interviews in that one Dark Side of the Ring episode, which was a huge get for the producers. He looked better than some of the more recent photos I've seen of him, where he's been pretty much wheelchair bound. Okada, I know, had wanted him to appear at New Japan's 50th anniversary show earlier this year. He was hopeful that Inoki would be able to make it, but he just physically was just not able to do it. They actually broke into the second hour of SmackDown to have Michael Cole break the news of his death, and Corey Graves acknowledged him as the first ever Japanese WWE champion, and he said that it's a reign that is not officially recognized. You would have never heard that mentioned on WWE television if Vince McMahon was still there. Never. Even when Inoki was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2010, in the video package for him, they never once mentioned his win over Bob Backlund. Because then they would have to admit that Backlund did not hold the title uninterrupted for 5 straight years, or 5.5 years, whatever it was. But it happened in Japan in 1979. Backlund was on tour there. And a week later, they had a rematch. So again, Backlund lost the championship to him. Later in the tour, they had a rematch, which Backlund won. But there was controversy involved. It looked like the referee, reversed his decision then and then hands the belt back to Inoki, who ends up vacating the title immediately after. 8 days later at Madison Square Garden, Backlund beat Bobby Duncum in a Texas death match to win back the championship. People in the arena didn't realize it was vacant in the first place because they never told the fans that the title was vacant. Our boy Vacant was causing controversy even 40 years ago. In his book, Backlund said the reason they did the title switch was a favor to Inoki to keep him kind of on the same level with Giant Baba, who had a few runs with the NWA title. It was purely an ego thing. Winning the WWF title would be a very big deal to him. So the fans in Madison Square Garden that night had no clue that Backlund wasn't the champion when he walked to the ring, and they had no idea that he had won the title back when the match was over. To them, it was just another Bob Backlund title defense. But Inoki, there's so much to uncover with him, or unpack. He trained under Ricky Dozan, who was the godfather of Japanese pro wrestling and popularized it in the years after World War II. That's the guy that Inoki trained under. And he and Giant Baba formed a tag team in the JWA, that was the Japanese Wrestling Association. I covered a lot of this a while ago when I was still doing the This Week in History segments. So they were a tag team together in the JWA, and later he was fired from the JWA because of a failed takeover of the promotion. Him and Baba were trying to take over. They didn't fire Baba because he was their main star. Inoki wasn't so lucky. The following year, he founded New Japan Pro Wrestling. It was 50 years ago this year. And Baba left later to form All Japan Pro Wrestling, and both those promotions are still active today. And Inoki positioned himself as the top babyface in New Japan. He worked with all the major names who would come in. He was the first man to ever score pinfall wins over Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair. There were a few more people that came after that. Arn Anderson did it. Sting absolutely did it. Those are the ones I can think of. But Inoki was the first. And there aren't too many people who can say that they pinned Hulk Hogan and I was going to say Brock Lesnar, but Brock didn't pin Hogan. He put a bear hug on him. So that's impressive. He had what is considered to be the first mixed martial arts match against Muhammad Ali in 1976. That's a big part of his legacy. You're gonna hear a lot about Antonio Inoki, and there'll probably be a video package that WWE will put together for him this week, and you're gonna see it right there. You're gonna see Muhammad Ali. That's gonna be a very big part of the history of his career. It was actually really boring. I remember watching that, and it was pretty boring. There were a lot of politics involved. It was a shoot fight with the rules very heavily skewed in favor of Ali. I don't think Inoki was allowed to do much of anything with him. He couldn't wrestle him. He couldn't grapple him. So his strategy was to lay on his back and kick at Ali's legs anytime he would get close, to the point where Ali had blood clots in his legs and he nearly ended his boxing career. But Inoki, you talk about his impact and his influence on the wrestling business. He helped make Vader's career. There would be no Big Van Vader were it not for Antonio Inoki. Inoki was looking for a new monster heel. It was supposed to be Jim Hellwig. He was going to come over to Japan to play the Vader character. Then he got the call from WWE, and he chose to go there instead and, became the Ultimate Warrior. He went from the Dingo Warrior to the Ultimate Warrior. So Sid Vicious was the other choice to play Vader. Ultimately, Inoki went with Leon White, and the rest was history. Inoki back then rarely lost. And here comes this guy Vader, challenges Inoki after his match that night is over, and their match doesn't even last 3 minutes before Vader pins him. So not only did Inoki lose, he got squashed. That was unheard of. That's also how you make a new star in one night. But his celebrity status, it went beyond pro wrestling. He got into politics in the late 80s. He was basically the equivalent of what a senator would be in the U.S. And there's a crazy story, and it's absolutely true, about the 100 Japanese families in Iraq that were taken hostage by Saddam Hussein. And Inoki flew to Iraq multiple times trying to free the guys who were still there as hostages. They released the women and the children, but they held the men. So he made a whole bunch of flights back and forth trying to, diplomatically find ways to get them released. And on one of his trips, he organized this peace festival. And he invited pro wrestlers and basketball players and musicians. This was all to try to win the release of the hostages. And he wrote a letter to Saddam. He ended up getting a meeting with one of his sons. I forget which one, if it was Dumb or Dumber. Whichever son it was, we'll call him Dumbass. Told Inoki that the hostages would be released, which they were. And so Inoki got credit for that. The Collision in Korea show is a big one. I talked about that when I reviewed the Dark Side of the Ring episode about it. That was organized by Inoki. He reached out to Eric Bischoff about bringing WCW wrestlers to North Korea. Hey, Eric, I got a trip planned here. He was going to bring wrestlers to North Korea for a show as part of another one of these peace festivals that was being held there. And, New Japan at the time had a working relationship with WCW, which is why he reached out to Bischoff. And Inoki was in office at the time. He was still running New Japan, but he was already, he was an elected official at the time. But he was embroiled in a scandal. Not the first scandal that he would be embroiled in. So he thought that this would be his way to make himself look like some kind of peacemaker. It's always an ulterior motive involved. It's always an ulterior motive for Inoki, to make Inoki look good. But there were 2 shows in North Korea that had mandatory attendance, which is why they had 165,000 people on the first night in the stands and 190,000, I think, on the second night. And Inoki headlined against Ric Flair because Hulk Hogan didn't want to go on the trip. Because why the fuck would he? Hulk Hogan is going to go to North Korea to lose to Antonio Inoki? That don't work for me, brother. For all these unbelievable things he was part of, he also nearly ran New Japan into the ground before it was sold in 2005. He gave life to New Japan Pro Wrestling. There would be no New Japan Pro Wrestling without Inoki. So, of course, people are going to talk about him in glowing terms and all that he did and all that he contributed. And all of that is true. But it's almost like, you giveth, you could taketh away. There were some years that were very bad, business-wise, for New Japan. And that was something Inoki also has to get credit for. And there were many times where he nearly killed the company. Long before that, before the company was sold in 2005, he nearly ended it with an embezzlement scandal. He was siphoning money from New Japan to his other business interests in South America. And I think it was like 84, 85, somewhere around there, wrestlers started confronting him about their payoffs, which is when they realized that he was stealing money from the company. So for all of his contributions throughout his career, there's a corruption that cannot be ignored. It is part of his legacy. You take the good with the bad, and there was definitely bad when it came to Inoki. That corruption is also what forced him out of politics the first time. But there will never be another Antonio Inoki. He's one of those larger-than-life characters that people are going to read about years from now, and they're not going to believe he did half the things that he is credited with doing. It's going to sound like fiction, but it's true.